Welcome, everybody, to the Alyosha Society. Right here, we are pursuing truth, beauty, and goodness through great literature. And the great literature we're looking at right now is poetry. You know it. Pink shirt, poetry goes together. Second poetry unit, Anne Bradstreet and John Milton. In the first one, we're going to be looking at Walt Whitman and Henry David Thoreau in this unit. So let's get right to it. Quick review. This is video number 2, by the way, if you're losing track. In the first video of this second unit, we basically did the overview, review, 5 different kinds of poetry, rules, that kind of thing. This is video number 2, so it's going to be our first video on a person you've probably heard of, but maybe you don't know a whole lot about him. Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman. So let's get right to it. First of all, quick review. Do you remember these? I'm not going to go over them again. Hebrew poetry, rhyming ideas, epic poetry, extremely long poem by an incredible hero relation to culture, Italian poetry, terza rima. It just seems like you should be either making or eating a pizza when you say that. Terza rima. Sonnet poetry, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Shakespeare is the king of the sonnet. Modern poetry. So let's get right to it, guys. Remember, we have been saying all along that this course is more about helping you have the tools to read different genres, literature, and such on your own. It's not about covering everything that's ever been written. No class could do that anyway. So we've been using what we call the historical biographical approach. And before we get to that, am I right or am I right about the beards? I told you in the previous video, look at these guys. I'm jealous. Walt Whitman, Henry David Thoreau, those are well-groomed. Yeah, beards are all cool now. Everybody's growing their beards. These dudes had it going way before it was cool. So I salute them. Historical, biographical approach. Remember, that means that when we're looking at this work of literature, this work of art, we learn as much as we can about the author. We ask ourselves, why is he or she writing this novel, poem, historical fiction, whatever the case may be? Then we ask the question, for whom is it intended? That's really important, guys. That's going to help you interpret it better. And remember, please remember, these are all great principles to remember when you are studying the Bible as well. These are just what we call good hermeneutics, hermeneutical tools. So, audience, time period. When was it written? You can't interpret a piece of literature based on 21st century assumptions and ideas if it was written 200 or 300 years ago. That's important. Genre, we've been all over that. And we're going to be focusing on that, these literary devices. We're going to be focusing on the literary devices a lot more in this video. So, Walt Whitman, let's get right to it. What does that mean? Well, what that means is we're going to learn a little bit about Walt Whitman. Now, friends, listen, I can't say this enough. I'm giving you something like an appetizer. You see, I'm saying, hey, look, if you're going to do this, here's a sampling of how you do it. So, for example, I think I've told you, the authors that I really love, and they would be folks like Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, Flannery O'Connor, Fyodor Dostoevsky. Those are some of my favorite, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf. Those are some of my favorite authors. I can't read enough about their lives. I just devour as many biographies as I can about them, because I want to know. I like what they're saying. I'm fascinated with their ideas. I'm enthralled by their art and their creativity. So I want to learn as much as I can about them. Guys, it just makes their works, whether it's Flannery O'Connor's short stories or Dostoevsky's novels or Jane Austen's, whatever the case may be, it just there's an explosion of understanding. An explosion of understanding means an explosion of enjoyment. You understand it, you enjoy it. All right, come on, let's get to it. Walt Whitman, he was born in 1819. So think about that. He was born not really that long after the founding of the nation in New York. He lived an extraordinarily long life for the 19th century. He lived all the way, he almost made it to the 20th century, 1892. Now look at this. I find this fascinating. Formally educated. Now look, you can't use this with your parents. You can't say, "Hey mom, I don't really want to go to school today because Walt Whitman only went to school until he was 11 years old." Yeah, well, guess what? No offense, brother. No offense, sister, but you ain't Walt Whitman. So, but I think it's fascinating that he had such a brilliant mind, a creative mind, and wit, but he was only formally educated until he was younger than probably everyone watching this video right now. What did he do after that? Well, he taught a little bit. He tried his hand at teaching. It just wasn't really his thing. It wasn't really his niche. He loved the material. He loved literature and history and so forth, but teaching children was just not his thing. What he really ended up doing was a lot of editing, a lot of writing of different kinds. He actually started his own newspaper. He sold it after a year, but he worked for a lot of different newspapers, and he edited, and he planned, and he wrote articles, and he just was a prolific writer. That's a good word for you to know if you don't know what the word prolific means. When someone says that so and so is a prolific writer, it means they wrote a lot. And you know what, friends? That's the best way to become a good writer. It really is. If you want to be a writer, the best thing you can do is just start writing and let someone edit it and get some training, but write. That's what Walt Whitman did. Now, the school of thought. So, where is he coming from in terms of his faith, his philosophy, his worldview? It's a big fancy pants term called transcendentalism. Wow, transcendent. That is somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 syllables. Yeah, you don't see a lot of 6-syllable words. What is transcendentalism? I am just going to take a big wild guess that most of you watching this video do not know what that is. So we're going to define it a little bit later. But that's his worldview. And when people think of Whitman and Thoreau, the first thing they think of are amazing beards. The second thing they think of is that they come from this idea, the school of thought called transcendentalism. We'll get to that. His most well-known work, by far, hands down, Leaves of Grass. Leaves of Grass. Now, you can buy what I have here, which is just a volume, and it's not, overwhelmingly huge, of all of his poetry. But Leaves of Grass was a volume of poetry he wrote for which he is most famous. Now, why is Walt Whitman famous? Why are we still talking about him in the 21st century? Well, this worldview, this transcendentalism, was very influential. I would say, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that it altered the course of Western philosophy in many ways. It reflected what the culture was thinking, but it also moved the flow of that thinking in a certain direction. I'm not saying it's good or bad yet, but it is what it is. So Walt Whitman's right in the middle of that. Sometimes historians and critics refer to him as what we call the father of, quote, free verse poetry. Free verse poetry. Remember we talked about modern poetry, that it tends to be a little bit more just out there, doesn't follow the rules as much. All right, you know what? We wouldn't have had that in the same way if it weren't for Walt Whitman. Okay. Sorry, guys, I lost my microphone for a second there. So that's that. Keep that in mind when we walk through his poems. You'll see that coming out. In other words, it's not quite the rigid structure of, say, the terza rima or a sonnet, the iambic pentameter, and so forth. But we'll get to that. Some people call him America's poet. Wow. When I was growing up, the Atlanta Braves were called America's baseball team. Now, some of you watching this might be thinking, boo. Yeah, that's okay. I know even today, folks still call the Dallas Cowboys America's team. Well, I definitely say boo to that because I'm a fan of the Washington team. We're called the Commanders now, but well, some people call Walt Whitman America's poet. And you know what, guys? I don't think that's far off. I don't think that's a stretch. I don't agree with Walt Whitman on a lot of his philosophical worldview issues, but he wrote a lot about what does it mean to be an American. What is that? What's the essence of that? And you know, he was a patriotic, country loving guy. And so I don't think it's a stretch to call him America's poet. You know, it's interesting. He was born into a Quaker family, but he didn't embrace that Christian perspective throughout his life. He really did not. And again, we'll get to the transcendentalism and so forth. In fact, we're going to get to it right now. Once again, the eternal question: where does Mr. Eder put his video so it's not in the way? All right, hang with me, guys. This is where we have to get just a little bit into the deep end of the pool. Put your swimmies on. A little bit heavy philosophy here, but it's going to pay off and it's going to be helpful to you. You'll remember, friends, that the 18th century was characterized by a worldview perspective called the Enlightenment, or as some historians call it, the age of reason or rationalism. So, what was that? Well, I can find truth right here. I have reason, I have logic, I have the scientific method. The Bible may say all kinds of things. A lot of that is bunk and mythology. I can figure it out right here. What is rational? Now, this heavy emphasis on the head, the mind, the intellect, friends, you know, I think I've said it before. All of history is the history of pendulum swings. Every time you have a movement that goes one way, guys, it even happens in fashion, it happens in music, it happens in art. So, what happens in the 19th century? Well, folks in the 19th century started thinking, hey, that's too much emphasis on the intellect and rationalism. That's cold and boring. So, the Romantics swing the pendulum to the other side and they put more emphasis on feeling and emotion and passion and nature. You see my point? They're kind of sort of two sides of the same coin or philosophical pendulum swing opposites, something like that. So that's romanticism. Man is basically good and he's getting better, and beauty and imagination and art and creativity. And rather than seeing God as we understand him, the way he revealed himself in the Bible, this movement, this romantic movement begins to see the divine in all of us. It's the divine spark. And you see it when you observe nature, and it's in you and it's in me and it's in the tree. Wait a second. I think I just made a poem. I didn't even mean to do that. That is a form of what we call pantheism. Now, pantheism just means all God. So pan is a Greek word for all. So it just means God is everything. We are God. The mountain is God. The ocean is God. So God just kind of infuses everything. It's not a Christian worldview. The Christian worldview has much more of a dualistic emphasis and says, no. God is other. We are not God. Okay, we strive to be like him. We want to love him and obey him, but we are not of the same essence. He is other. He is out there, and we are sinners and so forth. So pantheism, this transcendentalism, seeks to kind of muddy the waters between what God is and what we are, and it kind of puts us, in a sense, in the position of being God. So transcendentalism is this sort of romanticism on steroids. This emphasis on imagination, inspiration, art, the divine spark is in all of us, a bit of a pantheistic worldview. I hope that helps a little bit. You'll see it as you read more of the poetry, as you read Thoreau, as you read Emerson, as you read Whitman, you'll start to get a better feel of what it is. Free verse poetry, we said Whitman's the father of it. Again, not really so much a predictable meter, but it's not like prose. Okay, prose, when you hear the word prose, that just means like a novel. It just means normal writing. The writer's not trying to have any rhythm or beat or rhyme or anything like that. So free verse poetry, don't think, oh, well, that's just like prose. No, there are still intentional line breaks, and there's still a format and an artistic creativity to it that makes it poetry. So what Whitman and the Transcendentalists are doing is they're breaking with this traditional expectations and rules of poetry. And they're saying, we're going to create a distinctive American poetry. Our form and our art is going to reflect the individualism of the American spirit. Now, which one do you guys think this is most like? Of Hebrew, Italian? Yeah, of course. It's most like modern poetry. So Whitman and Thoreau would be what you might call forerunners of modern poetry. I wouldn't really call them modern poets, but they are certainly sort of, getting the pathway ready for what we would see in the 20th century. All right. Now, I want to give you some tips for reading Whitman. Just be patient. I promise we're going to actually read a poem here in a minute, but I'm getting you ready for it. We're going to read "Oh Captain, My Captain" in a minute, but some tips. First of all, some of it is written in iambic pentameter. So look at the poem and ask yourself, hey, this might be written in a meter that I'm used to, like a traditional sonnet. And one of the reasons that Whitman said that he did that was to mimic the patterns of sort of everyday normal human speech. That this is closest to the way we actually talk. So it's more pleasing. It's more aesthetically pleasing and so forth. We're going to define these. So I'm not going to dig into them a whole lot right now, but anaphora is a literary device that uses repetition. So if one line begins with the same word over, and you know what, this is all throughout the Bible, by the way. There's a lot of Psalms, especially that are written like this, where you have the repetition of the same word, same word. And it has almost this hypnotic effect to it. But I want to wait. We're going to get into it in a minute. Some critics have even said that they thought Whitman uses anaphora to mimic biblical syntax, that it gives it a bit more of a serious, sort of transcendent, epic feel to it. Again, creating this sort of, you get lulled into it, like the psychiatrist, the hypnotist who's trying to put you to sleep. Maybe, we'll see. Remember, guys, if every time I give you tips for reading poetry, I'm always going to include this last one. Read it out loud. Got to read it out loud. Listen to someone else read it. Read it with a group of friends. Even if you're by yourself, I don't care if your family members in the other room think you've gone bonkers and lost your marbles. He's in there talking to himself again. No, who cares? Read it out loud. Read it out loud. You'll understand it better. I know that sounds crazy, but all right. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to be talking about 4 Whitman poems. "Oh Captain, My Captain," "Song of Myself," "I Hear America Singing," and "A Noiseless Patient Spider." So let's get right to it. "Oh Captain, My Captain." Now, I'm not going to tell you what this poem is about yet. We're going to read it. I want you to try to help me out. We're going to try to figure out what he's talking about in this poem. Clearly, something very sad has occurred. But many of you listening to this video have probably heard this poem. You may have even memorized it. It's a very famous poem. Here we go. "Oh Captain, my captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every wrack. The prize we sought is won. The port is near. The bells I hear. The people all exulting, while follow eyes the steady keel, the vessel grim and daring. But oh, heart, 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 oh, the bleeding drops of red, where on the deck my captain lies, fallen, cold and dead. Oh, captain, my captain, rise up and hear the bells. Rise up, for you the flag is flung. For you the bugle trills. For you bouquets and ribboned wreaths. For you the shores are crowding. For you they call, the swaying mass, their eager faces turning. Here, captain, dear father, this arm beneath your head. It is some dream that on the deck you've fallen cold and dead. My captain does not answer. His lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm. He has no pulse nor will. The ship is anchored safe and sound, its voyage closed and done. From fearful trip, the victor ship comes in with object won. Exult, O shores, and ring, O bells. But I, with mournful tread, walk the deck. My captain lies, fallen, cold, and dead. Wow, that's a powerful poem. What's happening here? Who is the captain? Walt Whitman, the poet, is calling someone his captain. Well, that's obviously a positive. That's a compliment. If you call someone captain, you're saying my leader, my mentor, the one who is steering the ship. What are we without the captain? Where does the ship go without the captain? But who is the captain? Some of you know this, don't you? Some of you know this. It is actually Abraham Lincoln. Yeah, Walt Whitman loved Abraham Lincoln. They never actually met, but he believed in Lincoln. He believed in what Lincoln stood for, in his ideals. He thought he was a great man. And Walt Whitman wrote this famous poem after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated on April the 14th, 1865. Let me come back down here to discussion mode a little bit, guys. Sorry. Yeah, can get my bearings and so forth a little bit more. We'll go back to the slides here in a minute, but Lincoln was, for those of you who are a little bit foggy, or maybe you've never read about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, but Lincoln was shot on April the 14th, 1865, in a theater in Washington, D.C. called Ford's Theater. He was actually shot by a man who was a stage actor himself named John Wilkes Booth. He came up behind Lincoln, shot him in the head. Lincoln did not die immediately. He was taken for medical help and he died the next day. Why in the world would someone do that? Well, Booth was in favor of the Confederacy. He was a pro-Confederate. And this is right near the end of the American Civil War. And he was seeking revenge on the man that he believed was responsible for the downfall of his beloved Confederacy. Again, Walt Whitman never met Lincoln, but he felt he said he had felt a strong connection to him. And he believed that their political views were very much in line. So the poem is about Abraham Lincoln. So let's go back. Hang with me. All right, let's see what we got here. Wait, guys. Sorry. Friends, you would think someone who has used this technology as much as I have would be able to navigate this a little bit better. All right, there we go. Okay. And let's see. Hang with me. Turn off the closed caption. I have no idea why that thing keeps coming up. Okay, let's start here. So Abraham Lincoln. Now let's dive into the poem a little bit more deeply. And it might be a good idea if you have a copy of the poem, because I'm not on the slides I'm using here. I don't have the poem on every slide. We're going to be kind of bouncing back and forth and analyzing the poem so we can enjoy it a lot more. Do you remember the literary toolbox? You remember the literary toolbox? Historical biographical approach. We said, okay, if you really want to appreciate or understand any work of literature, dig into the historical context. Now, we know here the historical context is the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Does this poem make any sense at all? Well, yeah, it could make a lot of sense, but it would be sense that you'd be making up. It would not be the sense that Walt Whitman wanted to communicate. So the historical context is the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Biographical context, we talked about how Walt Whitman was aligned with Lincoln in his political views. He respected and admired Lincoln. So we know that this poem is a praise, a tribute to the man that Walt Whitman believed was his captain, Abraham Lincoln, who was now fallen, cold, and dead. We've already beat the dead horse of the genre questions over and over. What I want to focus on now is, elements of a plot are not going to apply here. That's really going to apply more to a story, a novel. So literary devices. Now, you are going to use the tool called understanding literary devices when you read novels. You're going to use them for every genre, but I think they may be particularly helpful when reading poetry, because poets are using, I don't know if you've ever gone through your dad's toolbox or your mom's toolbox. And I remember my dad was just, oh my word, he had the most amazing set of tools. And I remember when I was young, I would go through his toolbox, and I think half of the tools in there, I didn't even know what they were for. I'm looking at these things, I'm picking this thing up. I'm like, what do you do with this? I mean, I know what a drill is. I know what a screwdriver is and a hammer. What in the world? And my dad just had all these amazing, he had a tool for everything. And a lot of times, guys, poets are using tools. They're using very sort of complicated in some cases, but more intricate and involved literary devices. And if you don't know what those are and how they're using them, you won't get everything out of the poem that you could. So let's look at a few. Apostrophe. Let's get started here. So referring or talking to someone who is not there, or even say talking to a tree. I know, just time out. You may think, Mr. Etter, they put people in special hospitals who do that. No, I'm not talking about that. Let's say that I want to write a poem about a beautiful tree. I might use this literary device and say, oh, tree, your branches are vast and strong and bear the weight of the wind. And almost like I'm talking to the tree. That's very effective. That's a pretty cool way to write something. So in this particular poem, Walt Whitman is talking to Abraham Lincoln, but Abraham Lincoln is dead. All right. That's a common way, honestly, guys. If you look at songs, just listen to songs on the radio, you'll see this literary device used a lot. The next one, an extended metaphor. So it's when the author uses a metaphor in a series of sentences over and over again, sort of, but draws it out. So the author is taking one simple metaphor and applying it at length using all kinds of different thoughts and ideas and so forth. So look at the example here. If the captain is Abraham Lincoln, then there has to be a ship, right? See, you got to keep the metaphor going. There are sailors. If the whole thing is going to be a ship metaphor, then what is the ship? The United States. Abraham Lincoln was the captain of the ship. So, what was the fearful trip he's talking about? So you got to dig in and figure it what fearful trip, not joyous trip, not delightful trip, fearful trip. He's referring to the American Civil War, this horrible, horrible 5 years when we Americans killed each other to the tune of about 600,000 casualties. So, what's the prize? The prize is one. The Union defeated the Confederacy. That's what Walt Whitman is saying. And the Union has been preserved. The country is going to carry on. So, oh, Captain, you've sacrificed your life. You have steered the ship through this fearful trip, and the prize is won. But sadly, the captain lies on the deck, fallen cold and dead. Alliteration. I love alliteration. I am a big fan. I love prose, poetry, anything that has lots of, because it draws you in. It's aesthetically pleasing. It's beautiful, but it's simply the repetition of consonants, a bunch of S's, a bunch of T's, a bunch of M's together in like in the same line. The flag is flung. So you have two different alliterations there. You have F's and G's, safe and sound, double S's there. We might go back and reread the poem in a minute. So now we've looked at these literary devices, then you can, kind of appreciate them more. Imagery. Oh, friends, this is the tool of the poet. This is the literary device that poets love the most. Imagery, giving images of things that might not have anything to do with the thing that you're describing, but they illuminate it. Bleeding drops of red. His lips are pale and still, fallen cold and dead. So these are powerful images, colors, the red blood, the pale lips. They highlight the intensity of the experience and what it is that Whitman's trying to communicate. Juxtaposition, that's a big, huge, fancy word. Generally speaking, guys, juxtaposition just means when you're putting two things up against one another, maybe comparing them. So it shows a sharp contrast between two different things. So what Whitman is doing here is he's putting joy over here, joy that the war is over. We had an amazing president. He brought us through a tough time. So there are things to be joyful about. But at the same time, at the very same time we have all this joy, we have sadness. We're in mourning because our captain is fallen cold and dead. So you see that line near the end, exult, O shores, but I with mournful tread. Yeah. So let me go back. I know we're probably running. Now, I've given you some tools. We've gone into the poet's toolbox here, and we've talked about, personification, speaking to the object of the poem. We've talked about imagery. We've talked about alliteration. Quickly, I know we need to wrap this up. Now let's reread it. Oh, captain, my captain. Repetition. Our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every wrack. The prize we sought is won. The port is near. The bells I hear. The people all exulting. While follow eyes the steady keel, the vessel grim and daring, but oh, heart, 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 oh, the bleeding drops of red where on the deck my captain lies, fallen, cold and dead. Oh, captain, my captain, rise up and hear the bells. Rise up, for you the flag is flung, for you the bugle trills, for you bouquets and ribboned wreaths, for you the shores are crowding, for you they call. the swaying mast, their eager faces turning. Here, Captain, dear father, the arm beneath your head. It is some dream that on the deck you've fallen cold and dead. My captain does not answer. His lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm. He has no pulse nor will. The ship is anchored, safe and sound, its voyage closed and done. From fearful trip, the victor ship comes in with object won. But oh shores, exult, oh shores, and ring, oh bells. But I with mournful tread walk the deck, my captain lies, fallen, cold, dead. Yeah. So let's wrap up. Hold on a second. I just need to move forward. As you continue to appreciate Whitman, a few things. He sort of encapsulates the spirit of America, the American individual, the American experience, also the ideal America. Not only what America is, but what America can be and should be. And what Whitman wanted was for Americans to be loving, compassionate people, to be equal and to live as though we are all equals and benefit from the joys of being a part of this great thing called the American experiment. Now you can look at Song of Myself. This is a crazy long poem. We are not going to analyze and read that one on the video. You guys would end up hating this course. It would take hours. It's extremely long, but I encourage you to read through it at some point and look at the tips I've given you, the literary devices, and what it is that Whitman's expressing that I have on this slide. And you'll appreciate, I think, and enjoy that video, that poem a lot more. Okay, let's wrap it up. This is video number 2, Walt Whitman. So there is the outline. We'll do Walt Whitman in the next video, and then 2 videos on Henry David Thoreau. See you then, friends.